Okay, hello everybody, and welcome everyone online who's watching this afterwards. Thank you all so much for tuning in today. It's been a very exciting past week or so in the world of social housing. For those who didn't see, the social housing developer purchased its very first build, announced the acquisition of its very first building last week. So we're all riding a bit of a high. Very excited to move into this next chapter, and very grateful that y'all are along for this amazing ride with us as we build out permanently affordable, permanently publicly owned social housing in Seattle. To help us celebrate that and also just to ground us in the future possibilities of social housing when paired with like great land use and vibrant design for our cities. We are very lucky to be joined today by Timmy. Timmy, I actually don't know how to pronounce your last name. Can you let us know?
Timmy Koyejo.
Koyejo. Timmy Koyejo. Thanks for that. I should have asked beforehand. Timmy has come to share his expertise. Timmy is an urbanist and a housing policy researcher who will share about how social housing, when paired with zoning and land use changes, can transform our car-centric built environment to create more vibrant and sustainable neighborhoods, rich in public goods and local amenities in the process. Timmy is the Housing and Communities Policy Manager at the Climate Community Institute. And he works with movements, researchers, and policymakers to advance green social housing and green industrial policy for housing across the US. We had the pleasure of connecting with Timmy in Dublin when we were there at a social housing conference this past summer. Got to learn about some of your research, and we're very excited that you're now at CCI, and you're able to partner with us on this amazing presentation. So with that, I'm going to hand it on over to you to introduce yourself further and get on into it, and then we'll have a Q&A. Folks, please tune in. Feel free to put some questions in the chat. I'll mark them down, and then we'll get to them later on. But Timmy, over to you. Thank you so much.
Perfect. Let me start presenting. Can everybody, oops, got a little bit of a preview. Can everybody see my screen well? Great. Okay. Um, Thanks so much, Jeff. Really excited to get to speak about two of my favorite topics, green social housing and sustainable urbanism, and how the two together can really do more than they can apart. So I'm going to kind of give a really rough run of show. I'm going to introduce myself a bit and my background and how I've come to this topic, then talk about what I think is sort of the kind of tension or like the two ways that people are talking about zoning and urbanism and social housing, and then how I think they can be much stronger when talked about in a connected manner, and then walking through some real world examples of what this could mean, and then leaving it off with what can this mean for Seattle and Seattle's future. So that's a rough sketch. So to get started, as Jeff mentioned, I work at the Climate and Community Institute. We are a progressive climate and economy think tank that works with various movements and progressive policymakers to really aim to craft and enact a climate policy that really centers the working class and their material needs. And so um, we've historically worked on some Green New Deal legislation, like the Green New Deal for public housing, and some other policies that, AOC and Senator Bernie Sanders have introduced. Most recently, we've released a working class climate agenda that really kind of update some of our thinking for the present moment where the cost of living crisis and affordability are top of mind. And we really argue that climate and affordability need not be seen as a trade-off, but in fact that when you integrate the two together, that you can both tackle fossil fueled cost of living crises, as well as housing and transportation and energy cost barriers that a lot of working people are seeing. So um, just a plug for our new policy agenda and broader green economic populist framework, which you can find at our website right now. But I'll next kind of talk a little bit about my professional background that has brought me to this point. So uh, I live in Chicago. I've spent a lot of my, formative years in the city, and it also has really informed my thinking about housing, transit, and zoning. So uh, I kind of was interested in cities and urbanism for quite some time, and eventually I made my way to working for the city of Chicago in the Department of Housing. You can see my City Hall bike room tag. I tried to practice what I preached once I got there. Um, and one of the real first projects I got the chance to work on was the city had, in collaboration with a variety of community partners and stakeholders, had created a equitable transit-oriented development policy plan. And there's a few things I want to maybe define. So um, it came from the intuition and the understanding that the city, for some years prior to that, and this, I think, plan was released in 2019, had been trying to encourage transit-oriented development, or TOD, that is allowing for denser building around the city's transit stops in order to, reduce car dependency, enable more housing by transit, uh, and tackle both housing and transportation are really interlinked, and living by transit can reduce car dependency and can also reduce environmental pollution, carbon pollution, and so on. And so the city had this pre-existing TOD policy, but there was a recognition that uh, the kind of zoning incentives that had been introduced, it was concentrating the development only in certain parts of the cities, which were wealthier, more advantaged neighborhoods. And at the same time, there were kind of concerns rising about, like, what does this mean for potential displacement or gentrification, and like how can we kind of think about this more comprehensively? And so the ETOD policy plan kind of laid out like a wide range of ideas and proposals for how to try to meet the TOD goal, but in a more equitable manner. And there's a really amazing ecosystem in Chicago that works on these. We have this collaborative called Elevated Chicago. I definitely recommend you check them out. They work with a variety of community-based organizations and policy organizations to sort of steward this vision of ETOD, of walkable, transit-rich cities that are attainable for all residents of the city, not just advantaged ones. And this kind of energy ended up being channeled into a uh, big, big ordinance in 2022, which, as you can see, that headline, it kind of was really aiming to encourage more like housing, and especially affordable housing, by the city's like transit assets. And so while there was a lot that I gained from this experience, just from my understanding, and it was itself like a significant achievement, it also did kind of clarify for me that there was a lot of barriers also to this type of work, that our existing toolkit of policies didn't fully allow for. And so that also got me thinking about, um, what are other housing policy tools and urbanism tools that exist that can kind of meet some of these goals on the housing side, on the affordability side. And I started to get more interested in social housing. This was kind of also, I think, percolating more and more in the discourse. Like, what are alternative systems to have permanently affordable housing that also uh, kind of meets the needs of all, also in mixed income communities with better urban design or architecture. And in those conversations, like Vienna was often raised up as this kind of model city, if you will, that really has a lot of interesting, innovative policies that also and also kind of has this very um, inspiring like legacy going back almost 100 years of commitment to a social housing agenda, which now means like about 42% of the city of Vienna lives in social housing of some form. They have a lot lower housing costs on average compared to peer European cities. And it just so happened that as I was kind of getting interested in this topic, I was also thinking about going to graduate school and taking a break from the municipal worker trenches that I was in for those few years. And so I ended up finding a program in urban studies that was a really good fit. And I then went to Vienna for a few years to learn about the system in person. And so, there's a lot to be gained from reading about social housing, but it was really exciting and enlivening to be able to be in Vienna, to learn from those who work on housing policy, to meet researchers to, in my day-to-day life, like meet some people who live in social housing too. And that was a really great experience. And like I decided to kind of focus my research on like what does it mean for this kind of policy mobility or policy exchange between the US and Vienna, kind of focusing on efforts in places like Seattle and in Chicago also that were like trying to develop new social housing policies. And what does this mean? And so that was, my master's thesis. I'm not going to bore anybody with the details, but I kind of focused on looking at like what were these types of policy exchanges going on, and like especially given how divergent the housing systems in the US are and in Vienna. I mean, there's a variety of um, you know, quite vast differences, but at the same time, I was really interested in like what lessons are being shared and exchanged. And like there's a one of the kind of most famous housing developments, social housing developments in Vienna is called Karl Marx Hof, and it kind of is on the cover on the left, a model of it. And I was interested in like what does it mean to try to bring a version of that home to the US, and like if you will, a George Washington Hof. And actually there is a George Washington Hof in Vienna, which was a funny thing I kind of came across on one of my bike rides. But moving on from like Vienna, like I came back to the US, I was really able to plug into a lot of the social housing policy work going on, including at the Climate and Community Institute. And I think um, I'll abridge my backstory just for now, but that just kind of takes me to today and what I want to really focus on talking about. So, um, I think generally speaking, my perspective is that the US social housing and tenant rights movements and conversations are often siloed from sustainable urbanism or zoning conversations in the US. I mean, it's pretty evident um, to anyone who kind of reads and talks to people about the space, like they're coming at these topics from fairly different perspectives. On the social housing side, permanent affordability, tenant power, tenant rights are really front and center. And then on a lot of the zoning conversations, it's questions about urban form and the built environment, density, transit. And while there's, you know, as I will say, there's a lot of overlaps, like these end up, I think, being discussed in somewhat distinct communities and kind of framed and pushed in distinct ways. And this can unfortunately lead to uh, transit orientedness or good urbanism being sometimes seen as in contradiction with, permanent affordability or social housing, like kind of concerns about whether a version of TOD or walkable cities is a kind of a vector of gentrification, or kind of has these other detrimental aspects. And while I'll readily admit there are, tensions that do emerge in these conversations, I think too often the positive, synergies, to use a kind of funny term, are there on the table if we really integrate them well from the outset. Because the reality is that walkable transit-rich neighborhoods are increasingly a luxury. The homeowners are willing to pay a premium to live in walkable communities. The concerns about displacement around TOD or zoning changes that allow for, more a denser or wider array of housing continue to be the case, but um, it doesn't have to be the case that this is how that TOD directly leads to these negative repercussions. And my broader kind of framing up at this point is that, in focusing on buildings and streets and transit, urbanists are oftentimes really focused on the built environment, but in a way that sometimes leaves out the racial and class power relations that structure cities. And this is something that's really important and needs to be uh, addressed. But at the same time, for housing movements, for tenant organizers, a zoning and land use and building policies, wielded on behalf of working class people can really be instrumental in creating the just and sustainable cities that we want, and not just about technocratic regulations, but so putting the two together, you can really achieve a lot. And today, and for the rest of the talk, I'm going to be talking on a number of dimensions, from climate and environment to transportation, housing, and the built environment and zoning. And I'm going to be talking on a lot of these different dimensions because green social housing, urbanism, are really at the intersection of so many really critical topics, from housing affordability and stability to, good architecture and design, like the way our buildings and neighborhoods are constructed impact, community connections, how families are able to relate to one another, uh, walkability, safety, and accessibility of our neighborhoods. It's a huge element in terms of climate action, regarding green buildings and decarbonization, and then like enabling the kind of social infrastructure and public goods we really want to have, a just and vibrant quality of life. So I'm gonna kind of walk through some definitions and kind of reflections on zoning and then social housing, and then go through some real world examples later on. So just to I'm sure a lot of people have already heard about zoning, but just to put out the definition, definition of it is that it's a regulatory tool that cities use to, control land uses in specific areas and kind of what types of buildings can be created, their volume, their size, different regulations associated with them, like parking requirements. And, a lot of times zoning is broken out into different categories like, residential, commercial, industrial, manufacturing, and so on. And so it really is this kind of enabling framework. And I think what I want to talk about is just grounding the fact that urban planning and zoning can be used for good and evil, but also can be used for positive interventions. On the negative side, we've increasingly become educated about how the dark history of zoning from its instantiation in the early 20th century, the role of restrictive racial covenants that barred people of color from living in certain properties, to how policies like redlining that were created by a combination of the federal government, state, and local public sector leaders, also often in collaboration with local real estate interests as well, that really reconfigured where investment could ch be channeled within cities, and also led to the really the starving of resources in a lot of neighborhoods that were um, predominantly people of color or lower income, in spatial patterns which we can still see today. And so it's really important to know that history, certainly, but also to coming into the present day, that our current zoning and land use status quo is also not working. We live in very auto-centric cities. Traffic violence, injuries, and deaths are at unacceptably high levels. You know, low like the way that we have designed our cities that to prioritize car throughput often overall has made transit be less attractive. Ridership is lower than it could be in cities that used to have or do have still robust transit assets. Um, in other cities, transit was never developed because the car was assumed to be the primary mode of transportation. And as a result, many people have no option but to use their car, even when they would not like to. And beyond, burdening folks with higher costs of transportation or fuel costs, that also leaves out people who may, due to physical ability or illness, not able to drive around, children who don't have the agency to move around, and as a result, they're sort of parents are also forced to chauffeur them around. So it has these social implications. It also has our zoning and land use status quo has implications for air and noise pollution, for carbon pollution and emissions, and then also suburban sprawl. If our cities are kind of continue to be in these like low density car oriented forms, that also kind of pushes more development out beyond to even, green fields, to kind of further entrench this kind of car dependency cycle. And so like that's also a call to action that the status quo isn't acceptable either. Um, there's a lot of text on the screen, but I basically want to like walk through my sense of what zoning can do on its own and what it can't do on its own. And then I'm also going to go through that with social housing. So starting from the top, zoning is a really helpful, or can be a helpful framework for sustainable urban design and TOD, and kind of setting like a blueprint, if you will, for how our cities develop and grow. But at the same time, zoning isn't a transportation policy on its own. It doesn't transform car-centric streets or fully fund transit. And um, while it's an enabling factor, it's not going to change a lot of these other things that we need as well. Um, Secondly, zoning can uh, with housing production and make things cheaper to produce through getting rid of, costly parking requirements. That is, in a lot of zoning codes, for every like 1 unit of building, one housing unit that's produced, there might be a requirement that there has to be, 1.5 parking spots or 2 parking spots. And that can really drive up the cost of development, especially in transit rich areas of our cities. Zoning can also um, set certain stipulations around the the building form that can make green retrofits harder to do in terms of making buildings with greater insulation, for instance. And so there are some real things that zoning changes can do to reduce the costs and make denser housing available or make it easier to green housing. But it on its own is not like an affordable housing policy. On its own, it's not able to finance permanently affordable, high quality housing for working class residents at scale and meet all the needs and demands of housing justice. Zoning can allow for mixed income neighborhoods. It can allow for homes to be near cafes and shops and businesses. Uh, you may be familiar with the 15-minute city concept, but the idea that you're able to access your daily needs in close proximity. So while you can shift zoning to allow for that, zoning on its own is not going to kind of ensure that grocery stores or restaurants or small business open up in these areas that have been rezoned, and because that takes a lot more um, other uh, other kind of levers to be pulled, and a number of the ones I just mentioned are market actors, and so zoning is responding often to, or the changes you want in zoning often rely on private actors to decide to act. And lastly, zoning, I just was showing you some of the histories of uh, racial covenants and redlining. Like zoning can be really important to undo racial and class-based exclusion, especially, for example, repealing single-family zoning. But it also, while there are sort of different policies, like inclusionary zoning or other kind of interventions, it's not a full solution for gentrification or displacement. Displacement, whether it's through new construction of like what you might think of as like a new shiny building, but there's also displacement through gut rehabs of existing buildings. So even if an area isn't upzoned, for example, that can still that gentrification process can still be unfolding. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind. And like the broader point is that zoning is a permissive form of regulation. It provides permission or it enables things, some types of buildings to be built or exist or changed, but it's not a silver bullet for our urbanism or affordability needs. And moving on to green social housing, uh, it's a diverse set of housing types that, are sheltered from real estate speculation, have some public support, and give residents, significant say in their housing, built to high green standards. And there's a lot of different ways social housing can be developed, whether it be public housing, mixed income housing, um, community land trusts, etc. Um, so, green social housing really can do a lot, and it's something I'm really passionate about. And I'll kind of walk through some of the do's and that it can do, and what are the things that it can't do alone. So it is really critical towards addressing underproduction of permanently affordable housing. Our existing affordable housing system isn't fit for purpose to fully meet the needs that we have. But zoning, but sorry, social housing still needs zoning because status quo zoning can block new social housing from being developed throughout a city, especially in wealthy and amenity-rich areas. Secondly, housing conditions. Uh, you know, Social housing can help create, high quality green homes. But we also need to have zoning and land use work towards addressing, comprehensive uh, climate disaster risks and other interventions needed, to mitigate flooding, fire, and so on. Affordability, yeah, social housing affordability is really key to it, and combating skyrocketing rents that outpace wages by taking that housing out of the market. But at the same time, uh, transportation costs are really important, and we need our zoning to really allow for transit-oriented buildings that can allow people to not be forced to buy very expensive cars, very expensive gas, and therefore reduce car dependency. And lastly, we really do want the center tenant power and zoning or social housing, I should say, is in really that's a really key principle of social housing, providing some form of tenant governance. But also, if you're thinking expansively, for tenants to have the types of buildings or architecture that they want, sometimes zoning blocks that, and that can be a real barrier. And so, basically, again, summarizing that social housing is really critical, but it also needs changes in zoning to meet its full potential. And it makes sense that zoning is contested because it really touches on who has the power to shape our homes, communities, and our vision of the future. And which is often why these are can be such contested topics. I mean, my point is that green social housing and zoning together can achieve a lot more together than they can individually. And that we also, but that we also need to fight for so many other housing and social safety net policies, such as rent stabilization and rent control, for just cause eviction protections, for greater funding of tenant housing vouchers or operating subsidy, uh, you know, more funding for greening our existing building stocks and more thoughtful regulations as it relates to energy efficiency. So on and on. Also, like ensuring that we don't have to rely on our homes to be this asset that we use for college education or pull out money from the home for medical emergencies and so on and so forth. There's so many ways that there's so many other things that need to be changed alongside um, the ones that just green social housing or zoning can do, but it's kind of useful to think about what the two policies of social housing and zoning can do together at the same time. So I'm going to kind of go quickly through some examples, both internationally and then in the US before taking it home. So these are some photos I took from my time in Vienna. Um, there's some really well-designed social housing from, the interwar era of the 1920s and 30s. Like I actually myself I didn't live in social housing, unfortunately, but I lived right behind the social housing development called um, Roymenhof. And the photo on the right of the courtyard is what I could see. In This is the courtyard behind the building. There was a playground. There was a preschool. Like I would like regularly hear the kids like kind of screaming in delight at like 9 a.m. And it was really beautiful to be able to kind of see, like you can see the outside, but I got a chance to kind of peek into like the inside, if you will, of social housing. And then there's also like modern social housing developments that are, built to like really, lovely architectural standards with generous balconies, kind of a lot of green space, like another playground. And then inside there were community facilities. There was a community like workshop. There was also a food co-op within the social housing complex where people self-organized and so yeah, I'm giving like some highlights. It's a very complicated system. There's a lot of different buildings, and so not all of them had all these nice things, but it's a useful kind of imaginative thing that we can imagine like what social housing can be, especially when our zoning and building codes allow for it. And just to like really underscore, green social housing also provides the foundation for climate action, whether it be green building techniques like passive house, like residential building electrification, Um, there's lots of interesting I won't go too long on this, but CCI, Climate and Community Institute, we had a report about green social housing lessons from Vienna that I'd encourage you to look at as well. And also the way that a lot of the social housing in Vienna, like transit, is um, it's just more widely available, but even there's very foresighted ways that new districts of the city were built with a transit line first and then building housing and social housing around it. So oftentimes we talk about these like amazing things that are going on in Europe or Singapore or what have you, but there can be nice things at home too. And I want to kind of give some examples from my home in Chicago. So there's, really lovely mixed income housing that I've been to that has a public library on the ground floor. This is the type of co-location of public amenities that we really want to see in social housing. Uh, there's this this building is 100% affordable housing, and it was built on a municipally owned parking lot that was about 400 feet away from uh, the train in Chicago. And after a lot of advocacy and housing organizers and others, they were able to repurpose that land for social housing and for affordable housing. And so I think like these um, we have these kind of seedlings, if you will, that already exist in the US. But it's like, what does it mean to allow them to grow? Like, here's another example of and this is like kind of a lot of the ETOD that I was mentioning, the equitable transit-oriented development. This is a lot of what in Chicago we're trying to envision more of like new mixed income housing or denser housing that's like right by our transit assets. And a lot of what I showed you were like larger apartment buildings, but we also shouldn't limit social housing to like right off like, relatively busy roads or just right off the transit station. It should really go further into neighborhoods. I know Michael Eliasson, with the Seattle social housing developer, has really written and spoken quite eloquently about this, including at a prior House Your Neighbors Lunch and Learn, which I'll plug that you go watch on YouTube if you want to get all the juicy details, because he really talks about how eco districts and like the new housing that could be allowed for if we change our zoning and building codes to enable that. Um, and so like this is just kind of a provocation of like how do we make the co-locating of these public goods like standard practice in our social housing? And I'll just kind of say that I'm inspired by this book, Form Follows Function, which really kind of talks about how the economics of housing really dictates the architecture that we end up seeing in our cities. And like the same kind of overall principle applies to social or public or affordable housing. So if you see first you see the building, but then you also have to really get into the how is it funded, um, especially when you try to co-locate public goods, like that's another level of coordination and funding that's required. And it's just another level of things that we have to fight for and also think critically about to get to where we want. But what can this mean for Seattle? So I'm so lucky to be able to join right after Seattle's first social housing building has been announced, like an incredible accomplishment. And at the same time, there's the Seattle's comprehensive planning process is underway. Um, and there's a lot of different interesting ideas. I know there's the Complete Communities Coalition, which Jeff can speak more about, and they have a variety of interesting ideas for allowing denser housing and mixed use beyond material, incentivizing affordable and social housing via the zoning code, allowing the most growth in low displacement areas. How can courtyard buildings be allow this like kind of green space and to be amongst housing? Green building standards being encouraged, and also thinking through the way that transportation infrastructure has to be upgraded and made safer. Um, so there's a lot of interesting things that Seattle is doing, both the fact that it has this kind of nation-leading social housing developer, and it's also looking at its zoning code in a really critical and thoughtful way. And I think I'll end with just maybe posing to you all in the chat, like, what do you want social housing and zoning to achieve together? Do you have ideas for what um, it could look like in Seattle if the two were paired? And just really love the chance to talk about this topic, and happy to pass it back to Jeff now to either field questions, or also if Jeff wants to talk more about the comprehensive plan and some of the thinking that's going on for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Timmy. Can I give it up for Timmy? Show me some emojis, show me some love in the chat.